I know there are a couple of kids with us here today, but you are all God's children. If you want, you are welcome to come up so you can see what I'm going to be doing, because I have a really wonderful story to tell you, but you'll also hear it just fine if you want to stay there too. So it's your choice. But I've got a question for all of God's children today. What does it mean to be famous? Anybody got an idea?
Everybody knows your name.
When everybody knows your name, yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, famous, absolutely. When people know things about you, and it's like lots of people know things about you, right? Famous people are known by lots and lots of people. So here's another question, and you guys can just throw out some of these names. Who do you think is the most famous person in the Bible? Jesus. You guys did the stock children's sermon answer to every question well, you're right. It is Jesus. Okay. But who else? Let's think about, and Jesus is mostly talked about in the New Testament, the second part of the Bible. Jesus is definitely mentioned and referred to and pointed towards in the Old Testament. But who are some of the other famous people in the Old Testament? Moses, yeah, and? Abraham. Noah, Abraham, and? David. Who? David, yeah. We've had all those stories, yeah. There's a really famous one you haven't said yet. Pastor Betsy gives away all the answers. It's Elijah. Yes, Elijah. Now, we in our tradition don't seem to talk much about Elijah, but Elijah is really a big deal. Elijah was one of the central prophets of the story of God's people before Jesus comes on the scene. And certainly Moses is right up there. Absolutely. And there are lots of comparisons between Moses and Elijah. And so today, our story is all about Elijah. Now, the last few weeks, we heard about some of those kings, Saul and David and Solomon, who built the temple last week. But today, we're going to hear about a king who comes later, or this is where we're at. A king who comes later. His name was Ahab. And Ahab married Jezebel. And part of the challenge that the prophet Elijah had during this time is that Jezebel didn't believe that God was God. And Jezebel convinced Ahab and God's people that maybe things would be better if they worshiped a different God. That God's name was Baal. And that actually became kind of the thing. The kingdom and the people of God began worshiping this other God. Not our God, not the God who made all these people, who gave them promises and was faithful to all those promises. But because things weren't going that great for them, things got worse because they started worshiping this other God named Baal. In fact, they tore down the altars that were built to God, and they started building new altars to this other god, Baal. And they lifted up, and Jezebel appointed a whole bunch of other priests and prophets of Baal. And Elijah went and talked to Ahab about this, and Ahab didn't like what Elijah had to say. And Elijah said, if you keep going on this path, bad things are going to continue to happen for God's people. And then Elijah said, all right, I've done my job. I told him the bad news. I'm out of here. This is God's problem. And so he goes away. Well, it's a problem. And a drought comes. And when a drought comes, there's no water for the plants, and there's no water for the people or for the animals. And when there's no crops growing in the fields and there's no animals, what happens? starvation, famine, a great famine captures the land. And Elijah is off just trying to ignore all this. And God puts a couple of reminders in Elijah's way that Elijah still has a responsibility to God's people. And so Elijah comes back again. And he thinks, I've got to take a different approach. All right? And so Elijah decides, if I'm going to, I can't convince Jezebel. She's pretty invested in this Baal thing, and I can't convince all the priests and prophets that she's gotten lifted up and trained in the ways of Baal. And so how do I convince all the people? Lots and lots of people. He needs a big spectacle. He needs to make a big show of how powerful and how trustworthy God is. And so he sets up a contest and he challenges, he's one prophet of God, and he challenges 450 prophets of Baal to a contest. And this is the contest he sets up. He says, we will both worship our God by creating a sacrifice. We're going to build a fire. We're going to build a fire, and we're going to take a bull, a big cow, and we're going to chop up that cow and put it on our fire, and then we're going to step back. And we're going to pray to our God to light that fire. Because if this is really a sacrifice to a God who's worthy of our trust and belief and faithfulness, that God will light the fire. And they agree. So those 450 prophets, they build their fire and they put their sacrifice on there, and they start praying and dancing around and praying, and they go after it and at it and at it, and no fire. Noon comes, there's no fire, and they keep praying. Elijah sort of says, where's the fire? No fire. And they keep going, they pray all day long, no fire. So that evening, Elijah says, it's my turn. It's my turn to pray to the one and only God to prove to you all who God is. So, but he says, this spectacle isn't big enough just yet. So what I want you to do is pour water on that fire, on that pile of wood. Soak those logs. Pours water on it and soaks all the logs. Does wet wood burn? Not very well, right? Yeah. How about if not only soaking it once, but soaking it twice, and maybe even soaking it a third time, as if the logs themselves have been pulled out of the bottom of a lake? What is the likelihood that that fire is going to light up? Pretty small. And I'll bet those 450 other prophets were like, whatever. And then Elijah prays. He prays, O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your bidding. Answer me, O Lord. Answer me, so that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. You know what happened? Now, they said I can't actually light this, which I'm feeling a little, well, all right. And we're going to ask God to hold off lighting this, because all of you have turned your hearts back to God's story. And we can trust in God. And this is the story that made Elijah famous. Can you imagine this miracle that happened? And it's all because Elijah helped God's people turn their hearts back to God. Thank you for listening to my story.